Let's get more now on how this particular region is affected by seismic events. I'm joined by Stephen Hicks, a seismologist at University College London. Stephen, as we're talking to you, we're just seeing a lot of the rescue workers, and one of the shots that we have seeming to leave the site. They seem to be moving away with some speed. Why that is, we don't know. Maybe there's a fear that there could be further collapse that's happening. It is very unstable, or potentially further aftershocks. Stephen, in terms of the aftershocks that we've had, there were a number straight after the quake. Could there be aftershocks happening still?
Yeah, so straight after the earthquake, about 11 minutes after, there was a magnitude 6.7 aftershock. And generally for most earthquakes, on average, we expect the largest aftershock to be 1 unit of magnitude less than the main shock. So hopefully that largest aftershock, 11 minutes after, might be the largest aftershock it gets in the area, but we really can't completely rule that out. But there will be tens of thousands of aftershocks still occurring in the coming weeks to months, but those will, their number will gradually decrease over time.
So that was the aftershock that was about 6.6, which in itself is substantial, but you're hopeful that would be the worst of this particular quake?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at past earthquakes, on average, that would be the case, but we can't, there's a small, percent chance that there could be stronger aftershocks, or even a really small chance that there's another earthquake larger than the main shock. We can't completely rule that out.
And this is on a fault line. It is known to be an area where there are earthquakes, but no warning of a quake of this nature. There's no way to predict that this could have happened?
No, sadly, we can't predict earthquakes accurately in space and time. We can't pinpoint exactly where and when an earthquake will happen. This region of fault was sort of identified in some scientific papers that there's potential for a large earthquake, which we've seen today. But again, they can't predict exactly when they are going to happen. They just knew the hazard was there. But it's definitely, when I was woken up this morning by the alert that this earthquake had happened, it's just a complete nightmare scenario. As a seismologist, you know what earthquakes are capable of over many, thousands of years, but this is just, the worst kind of earthquake. Shallow, it's a very shallow earthquake beneath a highly populated area, very strong earthquake in a region which, of course, we can see the buildings just can't withstand this level of shaking.
And in terms of those buildings, a lot has been spoken about the kind of buildings that are constructed in order to try to withstand these quakes. But can any building realistically withstand an earthquake of this magnitude, that shallow in depth, very close to it?
If we look at places like Japan and California, I think the recent earthquakes in Japan have shown that, yes, the buildings can, they're built to absorb the shaking, they almost move with the shaking. But again, it's hard to know in this particular sense because of the frequency of the shaking, how quickly those sort of up and down movements occur over time could be very variable between earthquakes, and so it's really hard to understand. But traditionally, these sort of Middle Eastern style houses would not withstand anywhere close to this level of shaking.
And in terms of the actual shaking itself, the quake, the first large quake, how do we know how long that actually lasted for, the most significant shaking?
So when we talk about earthquakes, we often talk about an epicentre of an earthquake. When we talk about earthquakes this large, the epicentre is not just a single point. This earthquake's actually ruptured along a fault for about 400 kilometres. So imagine tearing a piece of paper and it tearing for 400 kilometres long. And that rupture has occurred over about 100 seconds. Now that's sort of the ground rupture, so that's sort of the tearing of the crust. But then the shaking as well, the seismic energy, that could last for hundreds more seconds, maybe, particularly when you've got sort of aftershocks occurring straight after the earthquake.
So that tearing of the Earth's crust, as you so vividly describe it, the quake will sort of have moved along that line, will it? Or will the whole line have fractured at once?
So it will start in one point and then move towards sort of generally in one direction. So in this case, the earthquake started at the epicenter close to the Syrian-Turkey border, and then it's moved to the northeast, we think. So that has, that rupture has occurred about over 100 seconds. and traveling at about 400 kilometres in that time.
When we talk about other parts of the world famous for earthquakes, I'm thinking now of California and places like that. There's this fear that the big one is coming, the big one is coming. Is that what has happened here in Turkey? Is this the big one, or could there, could it potentially be a lot worse than this in the future?
Well, sort of in recent decades, a lot of focus on the earthquake hazard in Turkey is focused on the northern part of the country. So there we've got a large fault line called the Northern Anatolian Fault. And this is where there was a large earthquake in 1999 that sadly killed a lot of people. And those earthquakes have appeared to move west towards Istanbul. So this sort of seismic hazard of the Istanbul region was focused on. I think people were less... there was less knowledge and maybe sort of understanding of this earthquake zone to the southeast of Turkey. This is called the Eastern Anatolian Fault Zone, purely because I think that there just hasn't been the same rate of earthquakes there. You can still have large earthquakes, but they just don't occur as regularly in time. So the last earthquake in that region was probably, pre-1900s, before we started recording instruments on seismograms. So I think that experience can sort of, whether you've felt an earthquake before in a region can then help you to sort of prepare for the next one. But if you haven't felt a strong one, that can sort of obviously affect your preparation.
And it could presumably also lead to complacency, because you might think, well, hang on, that's the earthquakes in Turkey, that's something that happens up around Istanbul, it's not going to affect us so much down here in the south.
And sadly, some of this complacency, you see it in a lot of countries. It can feed into sort of cutting corners when it comes to developing new buildings. So I don't know exactly what the rules are in Turkey regarding building development, but you do see some sort of level of cutting corners, and so buildings aren't always built to the same minimum safety level that they should be for certain earthquakes of this size. But whether the building regulations were sufficient to account for this sort of rare, close to magnitude 8 earthquake in the southeastern part of Turkey, I'm not sure.
OK, Stephen Hicks, seismologist, very good to talk to you. Thank you for your time.